everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I am delighted to have with me my friend Ooana Trien, who is joining me from Florida. But Ooana, you're a New Yorker at heart and by identity, if I understand correctly. Ooana is a theater artist, a fantastically talented one, and who I've got to know through the pandemic. Actually, Ooana, I got to know about you before we actually connected, and that was through your Twitter feed. This was back when I wasn't on Twitter, but I was sort of lurking, and I saw you post about dancing nurses. And the visual imagery of propaganda, essentially. We're gonna get to that. That's a teaser. So we'll folks who are listening, we're going to talk about the dancing nurses. But thank you for joining me and welcome to the Illusion of Consensus.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really honored to be here, and I think it's going to be a really great opportunity to talk about two seemingly very distant fields, but they're actually not.
So first, you're an artist in New York. You're a theater artist in New York. You had a career before the pandemic.
Well, I would say even more importantly than that, my training and my I would say my lineage is rooted in New York. So I was born in Jersey, but I attended Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, and I graduated in 2000 with two concentrations. One was in experimental theater, and the other one was in classical theater. And then I realized as I was graduating that I didn't want to be a performer, but that I loved the art form so much, and so it was it stays with me very much so. And yeah, but I'm in the New York diaspora, so I'm in a southern borough called Florida.
So how did you end up in Florida? So what led you to move out of New York to Florida during the pandemic?
Well, if you'd asked me if I would ever move to Florida, even just 5 years ago, I would have thought you were crazy. There's an old Jewish joke that this is, God's waiting room, right? But honest and truly, I was not planning on it, but I could not get the vaccine because I have a condition called CRPS. And my doctor, who is a pain management, and an anesthesiologist, head of the department at his hospital in New York, he told me that I shouldn't get it and that I can't get it, quite literally. And I was so struck. I mean, already the lockdowns had been terrible, but I never had expected the madness and the isolation that came after the mandates. And I had been invited down here to this part of Florida, which is, St. Petersburg, which I did not know existed outside of Russia until I was invited here. And to be honest with you, there was a moment, and it was actually someone I'd also met on Twitter who didn't know me, who saw sort of what was going on. A former New Yorker saw how I was getting kicked out of even a dance class because of my vaccination status, and just how soul-crushing all of it was. And he invited me here, and the moment that I realized that I might be actually moving to Florida was a very strange, simple one. I was on a beach here, and he said to me, and I was very sad. My whole world had been taken, and he said, "Look up, Ooana." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Look, no masks." And I burst into tears. And within a few days, I called my mother and said, because she's from Eastern Europe and lived under the communists, and I used to visit Soviet Romania quite a bit as a child, because my grandmother and uncle were there. And I said, "Mom, I feel like going back to New York. It feels like I'm going to Bucharest in 1983 or 84. And she said, "Get an Airbnb for a month and take it one step at a time. But once you see sanity, you can't unsee it." And
that's such an interesting comment, right? So you're a lifelong New Yorker in heart and soul.
Almost lifelong. I mean, a whole adult life since I was 18. It was the only place I applied.
I mean, at least in soul, if not physically. And I think it's striking to the sense of uprooting that you're describing.
Yeah.
Because of the vaccine mandate, essentially in New York, not just the mandate, but like the social sanction against people who decided not to get the vaccine for whatever reason.
Or in my case, literally could not. So there was no question that what was happening was absolutely, like, I could not rationalize it.
One of the themes I've has shocked me through the whole pandemic, that through public health, has been this idea that people who don't get the vaccine are unclean.
Right.
so unclean that they're not allowed to be in polite society.
Right.
Right now, and I think back to the HIV era,
Oh yeah.
where when public health didn't do enough to dispel that notion in the public, where HIV patients were seen as unclean. Now, this is something that's personal to you, of course.
Very much so.
So why don't you tell that story?
Well, I'll add to it, which was it's more than that I was unclean, and I think this also relates to the time of the AIDS crisis. Is the best analogy I can give would be that I could not get, the mythology was is that, everyone gets the vaccine because there's somebody else who can't. So that's how the sort of mythos about, how this is the for the greater good or, basically game theory. But as someone who could not, the best analogy I could give is that let's say I was allergic to peanuts and suddenly because I'm not eating peanuts, I'm being accused of not only being anti-legume, but giving you a protein deficiency. That's what it was like. And what was particularly frightening about that is I remember the AIDS crisis really through the eyes of a child because my father founded the Fire Island News, which was a small weekly paper in Fire Island. And my mother ran it from 1986 until 1996. So during some of the worst, moments of AIDS where, as Fran Lebowitz, the cultural critic, says that we lost people faster than almost in any war. I mean, it was just, and I would argue that COVID has some very similar qualities, unfortunately, but the policies rather. But I knew as a child a lot of the, people who were founding the JMHC, and then, I didn't view it as a political thing. I mean, I was a child looking at these incredible men, some of them the most talented people through the arts and success. This was in mostly the Fire Island Pines and Cherry Grove a little bit, but all I remember was thinking every year, every summer, I hope Uncle so and so isn't dead, or celebrating when somebody was, stayed alive to actually talk about what happened, because in some ways, it feels now that the loss of so many of those people who remembered is very much reminiscent of the loss of the people who remember even surviving the Holocaust or Stalin. I mean, there's a whole memory that's just being eradicated, and one of the most horrible moments of and it was early on in COVID policies. Like, it was actually, I remember the date. It was March 17th of 2020 that I knew something was wrong. That exact date, because of an article that had been published in MIT Tech. And I remember reading, it was called "We're Not Going Back to Normal," was the name of it. And Gideon Litchfield, I think, was the author. And in it, it laid out in this new way that isn't at all, I mean, to have it be coming from MIT Tech, which was, it's supposed to uh, utilize, scientific inquiry, not editorialize instantly, which is, having come from a journalism family, I recognize that pretty quickly. And we did not do that in our small little weekly Mickey Mouse newspaper. We had a very sophisticated weekly Mickey Mouse newspaper, as it was, as it was called. And to watch very, like, almost like a, in retrospect, it's hard not to see how planned the whole thing was. But in that moment, I will never forget this one section of the article. It said, much like we did after the terrorist attacks of 2001, we will accept such measures. The increased surveillance will be a small price to pay for the simple freedom to be with other people. And I
I mean, of
just,
course, the policies themselves were isolating. They weren't aimed at making us be able
we
to live
weren't
with
even
others.
into 2 weeks to flatten the curve at this point. So this is this was day one of flattening the curve in New York City. It was,
Right. The philosophy is that you're a biohazard I'm a biohazard. We should treat each other as biohazards rather than as fellow human beings.
It's worse than that, though. I think that a
It's pretty bad.
biohazard. It is. It's worse. So a biohazard can have an impact on the world, right? You have a biohazard. Suddenly, people have to react to the biohazard because something has to be done because there's something true about a biohazard. Let's say this was worse. We were suddenly told that we were inessential. That nothing about that. This this moment for me was so striking because I remembered how particularly I was immediately thinking back because of Fauci being, the face and the name that we were all seeing again. And I knew his name and his face and his since I was 10 years old. And I remember what I'd said in public was I had presumed that Larry Kramer had forgiven Fauci. And if Larry could forgive Fauci, I said, so could I. But on Facebook, I remember saying to people, please be cautious with, giving this guy carte blanche to believe he's just a hero, because I can tell you right here and now, he's a very flawed person that made many mistakes and participated in many mistakes. And the one that stood out to me then that I was trying to caution people about was I remembered. So I was too young probably to be getting involved in what was at the time considered advocacy for HIV and AIDS. I mean, I was in high school. I was standing up in front of classrooms of it was during I went to a private school, so we had a study, like we had a headmaster's recess in the in the middle of the morning, and I would stand up there before I had ever lost my virginity or ever had sex, telling people about safe sex, because in my mind I knew that there was likely to be somebody in that room that was going to graduate who might do not be informed about what I knew was going on in gay communities that I loved, with people that I loved and adored. And I knew that also there's this sort of, especially back then, and there's something to be said about that, that there's almost a hidden sphere of gay life, that if you are a young man coming from the suburbs going into a city, that you're going to go through sort of an initiation rite of some kind. And if you don't know about this, you could get sick. That was my thinking. That was just my simple thinking about it. And I wanted people to know. So I was just trying to tell them what I had heard in conversations, as a kid. But also when I was too young to, I would lie about my age I did this, I think, I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 times. Simply that I could also lie about who I was. I once pretended to be someone's daughter so I could be there with him in a hospital because his partner couldn't be. But I could pull that off. And I was there when he took his last breath. So I saw what was happening to people. So the memory that I had in trying to understand what was going on is I had heard a lot about in San Francisco, the 18B. There's a documentary about it called 18B, which was um, it was the wing of a San Francisco hospital, which one I can't remember right now, where the staff had done something extraordinary. They had made a decision and this was prior to knowing transmission at all. Like, how was this transmitted? They didn't know if it was airborne. They didn't know if you could get it from saliva or urine. And this was a very, there was a period of time. I remember when there was someone who was sick with AIDS that was staying with our family. We were worried and cleaning the toilets because we didn't know, right? But they decided to treat AIDS patients like human beings first and foremost. And nurses, doctors. In fact, one of the nurses there was Jane Doe, the one who pricked her finger with blood. That one. So the story about her came from there. But it was such an exquisite thing to see that these men weren't allowed and simply left to die alone because of the bravery and the heroism of these people. And the
Yeah,
risk.
this was one of the formative experiences for me also in medical school. This is in the early 90s. And I remember it's like it was in Stanford Hospital. There was I was on the ICU for a month, and there were all these dying men. But, I mean, young men, not much older
Right,
than me, some younger, as young as me.
right.
I mean, I was a young man back then. um, and
Which is even more scary if you're looking in the mirror, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Somebody who
and
looks,
I was just like, I thought to myself, okay, this is if this is my life, my future is to like be caring for people like this. It's a worthwhile future, but it's just a tremendously depressing one. Like these are
Oh God,
people
yeah.
that should have been spending their lives, living their lives to the full, not spending it in the ICU, in dying.
But also the way that they died. I mean, people don't, I think,
No,
realize that
it
during
was
that
really
period of
tragic.
time, how quickly it happened, and this idea of
So
walking
I
skeletons
want
and why that happened as well. But what I was going to
to.
say is that Fauci wrote, what stuck with me ever since was that, and I think this is one of Larry Kramer's main bones of contention with him, and many people's bones of contention with him, is that the from 18B, it started to be that people were not walking around afraid of having a waiter who had AIDS as much. They started to realize, because it was definitely determined through the risks taken by people at 18B. And some might even say that they were foolish if somebody had kids, but at a certain point, that's what heroism is. You have to, you make the best decision you can, and you can't know for sure. And it's not just based on safety, it's based on morality. Like, what do you do for a fellow human being? And this started to spread into our culture. And then the moment that, God, I will never forget this, was there was a doctor whose name I cannot remember, a researcher who was couldn't get peer reviewed at all on this one. Like, no, I remember the people who knew him said that this wasn't accurate. He was claiming that there had been transmission from parent to child of HIV, and I don't mean through breast milk or through even even intercourse, which would, I mean, it's a horrible
Oh,
thought,
by
but
hugging,
casual, like
routine
literally
household
by
contact.
casual contact, right? And he couldn't get any traction until Fauci wrote some editorial agreeing with this.
Yeah, I
And then
mean, it was
suddenly
actually
everything collapsed.
it was published in JAMA, the Journal of American Medical
Right.
Association, and
Exactly.
then Fauci wrote an editorial and amplified it. And it, I mean, I was too young to understand what was going on at the time. This is like
Right.
1983 or something. But that really was I mean, in retrospect, an appalling thing to do. Right? You essentially are
Yeah.
amplifying evidence that's very, very
I'd say it was
uncertain.
later. It was later than 83. It was closer to like 88 or 87
I
because
mean,
it was,
but in any case, whenever it was amplifying uncertain evidence in a way that would almost certainly cause people to treat HIV patients as if they were biohazards, as if they weren't even human. Um,
well, and also, not like, let's say there was a child who had somehow gotten HIV. You're certainly not dealing with how that child probably got HIV. I mean,
I
it's
just read,
horrible on so many
I just
levels.
finished reading Fauci's biography. So I do think, to be fair to the man, I think he did deeply care about HIV patients. He did. I mean, I think it's, there's
Well,
certainly flaws in how he thinks,
there's a
but his,
story I heard, and I'll tell you, because I'll say that, to say somebody cared, it's like in that movie, there's a reason we call caring a lot. Like, there's some people who will care, but Lord help you if they're caring, right? Or what their motives are for caring. And I'm not saying that this is, but I've now kind of, I remember in Larry Kramer's open letter to Dr. Fauci, and the question becoming, why did, with everything that had happened, why did he stick around? And I've heard some theories on that, on like what gave him so much power. But the story that I remember hearing, and I've even seen it written, and I think Fauci even tells this story, is that it was 2000, I think, and there was another HIV conference going on, I think, in California, the yearly one, and no major progress had been made in terms of finding a vaccine, or there was not another leap, and there was still, there was definitely people who were on the cocktail, but there was no visible, like, the things were
by the
going
way,
to change.
that cocktail was miraculous. I mean, basically, it transformed uh, Stanford Hospital from like a place where there's dying HIV patients to, I mean, they're just healthy on this
Certainly,
relatively healthy
but
on this
that would
point.
have happened a lot faster. And this is what Larry was talking about early on in that letter, is that much like what was going on with hydrochloroquine and ivermectin, which is another same phenomenon, and also similar to a cocktail, right? What I kept hearing when people were talking about we need a vaccine or you need only this one drug was, I had AZT just rolling in my head, and I saw what AZT was doing to people, and in retrospect, we know that there was a lot of cronyism involved with AZT, and I watched as men on AZT, including a friend of mine's father, just, I mean, it was a horrible way to die. I mean, it was not. It was horrible. And so when the one in 2000 is that there's this moment, and I'm 99% sure that he tells us too, that he goes into, he's very sad about there's no progress going on. There's nothing. And you can hear him saying that, he cares a lot, but I wonder what his motivations really were. I mean, he'll care a lot about whether or not he gets to get what he wanted to be the, to sort of, Georgian retirement syndrome. Like he wanted to slay the dragon. And so he tells the story that he comes into a cafeteria and there's this man sitting there. And remember, there were tons of gay men who were screaming and saying, let us try this, let us try that. And it was, these all these trials you're putting us in, we're dying while we're waiting for the trials, right?
Yeah, this
And
is. I think this incident is in the band played on.
it might be the book that's been playing on. And so it's not in the film version, as far as I know. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the films. Longtime Companion is the only one that really hits me like a freight train, and I just can't stop crying when I see it. But he looks at the man, and the man's he's very calmly, very rationally says, Dr. Fauci, I'm going blind. You're keeping me waiting. You're making me choose between life, death, and going blind. And this is AZT. AZT made people go blind. And Fauci, what spooked me was not that Fauci tells the story, but his response, like him saying that the reason he acted on that was he said, this man didn't sound, he wasn't yelling. He wasn't, upset. He just said this. And I said, are you kidding me? That it just took somebody restraining for you their emotions. And that's sorry about that. I'm going to probably do a little cut there. And that's straining their emotions. And that's what it took. I mean, you needed to be a member of polite society in order to, and this was what Larry Kramer was getting so angry about all the time.
Of
And
course.
then what created ACT UP, which even Larry Kramer himself, I mean, this was the unfolding that came from this. I don't think it was only HIV itself, but I think that the tragedy of what happened with HIV was they saw, or we witnessed, politicization of health and how it could become such a tool for political power, including, I think, even what would have been originally a debate about, civil unions, which was entirely related to HIV/AIDS. Why I went to a hospital, right? Because it was very easy for bureaucracies or any systems that were in place to deny visitation, which we saw again with COVID, and then also deny inheritance requests. So, like in Fire Island, I remember hearing stories where somebody would own a business there, and then one person would die of HIV/AIDS and had put into their will that it would go to their partner. But since they had no legal relationship, which is why many of these men would even adopt their partners, even if the age difference didn't make sense. Like if they were trying to find any way to just. And this is the thing: is it was not about, for these people. I never saw this as being about politics. They were about, if you've got men who don't have children, right? And a lot of these were artists and such talent. And Fran Lebowitz describes that with the audiences we lost to AIDS. I mean, just the culture itself was, eradicated like that. That these were people that wanted their partner to have the legacy and the lineage of what their work had been doing all along. And there's something beautifully true about this, that I mean, I'm a childless woman, not by choice. COVID certainly has impacted why I'm a childless woman.
You
And
recently married though, so there's some happy news there.
yes, but I mean, but to be in reason, I'm 46. And so here, I mean, within reason, again, this is another question, is that yes, I could potentially use science to do something, but what is the cost of that? Also, what is the cost to my future child? It's not like I'm going out and buying a Birkin bag or a Chanel bag. It's something it's not an easy, doesn't feel good. It's not a thing I'm delighted by, but it is something that we could see. And I think on a very real way from these men that I knew as a child, I learned from them because their lessons in morality and their lessons in what it meant to be, what love really meant for them was very different than the way we see it being misused now, because restraint and choices both were such a part of that world. And it also was, and then the question of also who survived, right? And why. And that that really impacts me personally right now in this whole
Okay,
thing.
so I want to explore this, and in particular, I want to take the person of Larry Kramer, who did ultimately forgive Fauci.
I
In fact,
disagree. I don't
that's
think he
I mean,
did, because you can find other writings about him where he says flat
well,
out
okay,
what he
let's
thinks.
in any case, let's just take Larry Kramer because I want to contrast something. Did the artistic world in the 80s and 90s, they rallied around HIV patients
It
in many
rallied
ways.
around the talent, and also, but that was not because it was automatic. It wasn't just empathy.
But my
The
point
most
is that
talented
they
people
played
found
a
ways to
very
do it.
important role in instructing,
100%.
in telling the stories of HIV patients,
100%. Yes.
humanizing HIV patients, and sort of instructing the public.
Yes.
Instructing is the wrong word. Sort of showing to the public
No,
these are
but they
these are
were
these are
instructing as
fellow human
well.
beings,
No,
right?
you're absolutely right. Though it was a level of instruction. I would argue that there's nothing wrong. They were teaching. That was what was so
And the
beautiful
thing is
about
this,
it.
like they didn't marginalize HIV patients within the artistic community. They embraced them.
Yes and no. There was a level. There was definitely some, like, if you watch the film Longtime Companion, they depict this beautiful. Longtime Companion was the first film. It was in '86, I believe, that came out about HIV/AIDS. It was filmed mostly on Fire Island. It actually had probably the first male on male gay kiss, but it showed what was going on in New York, in because it all takes place in New York, within both politics, but Fire Island, as well as in TV and in theater, which is very different than what's going on necessarily
Well,
on the
let me
West
just
Coast.
can I say a contrast? What happened with COVID was the artistic community
Right.
blacklisted people who had who didn't get the vaccines, who didn't were skeptical about the masks, uh, and I didn't see almost any art that came out of the pandemic where someone who got COVID was humanized or who
There
decided to take a
was
risk. I mean,
there
there's
was
none of that.
none
It's like this dehumanization and blacklisting of
completely.
people who were like you, who were skeptical about the narrative.
Well, it was
Uh,
blacklisting of people who even weren't necessarily sick. I mean, that's the crazy part. I was seeing children playing on the
because
next door with
you
masks.
do things that are unclean because you're not vaccinated. You do things that are unclean because you just choose you don't not wearing a mask outside. I mean, there's this like this sense of clean and unclean that normally I always thought the artistic community in the United States and Europe would push back against, and yet again, I'm not
Right.
in the artistic community. I'm just speaking to the outside, just as a consumer of this. Um, I saw instead an embracing of this clean and unclean distinction that absolutely shocked me. It's so contrasted with my view of things, of how the artistic community related to the HIV story.
Well, I think
Such
that.
so different.
So I think that we were touching on there. So when I was at Tisch, I studied the role of ritual in the arts and ritual in theater, particularly, and it was. I actually have the text. I would almost, if you bear with me, if we could pause. I'm going to go grab it because this is going to blow your mind. I think it's actually um, it's a rare. It's a paper that
Okay,
you almost can't find anywhere. Just let me grab it real fast.
okay, Juana,
So
you have some text you were going to show us.
right.
Let's.
So when you were talking about this idea of unclean versus unclean, right? There's so this text is called, its own readings on ritual studies. Brought by crime. Now, this text is from, I believe, it could be as early as '89. Let me double check. It's from 1996. So I was in college in '96, and I was studying the arts. But at Tisch, we were not just doing conservatory training. There was a lot of we had to study the history of the arts, but in many angles, and it hadn't fully been, as we say now, wokeified. But I saw it coming in, which is part of what's the influence. But this is a text that I never thought that I would. I think I look at this text more than probably any other book that I own. It's very hard to find, but it comes from when ritual studies or the social sciences was still a science. Prior to everything getting more politicized, there's this incredible piece here by Albert Bergeson, who's actually if I'm remembering correctly, he was actually a rabbi that had specified, like, he had also studied social sciences, who had recognized that how human beings experience tribal communities. But he also expanded on this, and so he he calls this is the idea of the political witch hunt ritual, specifically. And it says in the introduction, and this is from Bergenson, 1984, A Theory of Political Deviance. And it's from The Sacred and the Subversive, Political Witch Hunts as National Rituals. And he says that not all ritual processes are either intentional or explicitly recognized. Political witch hunting, for instance, displays many of the qualities that scholars consider typical of ritual. Some sociologists and political scientists regard witch hunting as ritual because of its scapegoating dynamics. Witch hunting refers not only to literal trials of alleged witches in Salem, Massachusetts, or in medieval Europe, for instance, but to any social movement in which a particular group, imagined or real, is stigmatized as deviant and threatening to the state. In the theoretical traditions of Emil Durkheim and Kai Erikson, Bergenson here argues that states do not merely tolerate deviance, but actually need it, and therefore generate it. In effect, states invent witches in order to dramatize their own enduring values. This process of imagining and then dramatizing a society as if it were divided into mutually opposed groups is, for Bergenson and some other sociologists, ritual. He proposes an exploratory model of the witch hunting process that links its rate and dispersion with the degree to which the values of corporate organizations are immanent in the everyday life of a society. So early on, I was predicting that, and I, having been receiving it, that this was going to happen. But what he also says, he breaks into a model.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual. But it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal, mental, and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed, generalized kind of medical advice. And less and less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of a general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For the subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word illusion, and you can get your discount and you won't regret it.
So, I mean, like, just let me query this for a second. So in other words, in the context of COVID, the witches are the people who don't agree with the public health authorities. The witches
Well,
are
it's
team
not only
reality.
that. It's not only that. It's something far more striking about. He says that. So what he first explains is that it's been determined that a society will create laws or criminality based on not, and I'm not speaking, you have to remember that this is a time when you have to look at this through a political lens, because it's not a political phenomenon. It was just the way societies operate, that you could have any society or any group that they will need occasionally, for example, the criminal, so that they can reinforce their shared values if it's just a group of people, right? So, you come together. That's what sort of the mass formation is, the extreme of this, right? But what he's saying is something else. He's saying that um, that's sort of the Durkheimian concept of criminality comes from that idea, right? So why is there white collar versus blue collar crime, or why is there different strata, or why is there clean versus unclean? And within ritual itself, clean versus unclean is a huge concept. But what he says here is that a formulation asserts that a large volume of deviance will appear. Its distribution within a society's social structure is left unspecified. So what determines how this spreads? He has quite literally a simple model, very simple y-axis model here that comes at the end of the paper. And the conclusion he came to and said was the following. He says that ritual government actions and the creation of political subversives. So sound a little familiar to you as well. He says that political deviants are created by the social definitions and labels of deviancy the community can apply. Although it has traditionally been understood that deviant labels are applied by social control in situations such as police, prisons, or hospitals, labels of deviance can also be generated and applied in institutions other than those formally chartered functions of social control.
I mean, this
In the
is this is
line,
this is really, really perceptive. I
and
mean,
and
I
then
guess I
it's
have to say, Juan, I never thought I would be uh, on the tail end of that I would be a political deviant.
Well, it gets even crazier because he predicted what happened to all of us. So he says this, and he says, in line with Goffman's 1956 idea that the construction of social definitions can be accomplished by numerous ritual activities, we will include the actions of political authorities as the principal source of deviance labels. As mentioned earlier, government authorities are formally constituted agents for the larger society. And in this capacity, they act for that community in defining the meaning of political subversion. This social construction of deviance could be accomplished in at least three general fashions. And he breaks it down. He goes, ritual accusations is the first. He says the simplest mode of defining the presence of subversive, counter-revolutionaries, reactionaries, spies, or espionage rings is the mere statement that they exist. They would include Senator McCarthy's claim that there was X number of communists in the State Department, or a claim by a Chinese political elite that class enemies have sneaked into our ranks and are plotting capital restoration. In effect, any statement, speech, or press release offered by a constituted political authority to the effect that subversive elements exist, or that the nation is somehow endangered, constitutes a ritual mechanism for defining the presence of subversives. Then he said the traditional social control mechanisms is the next one. And he says that this is, courts, things you name it, stuff we were seeing processed through. And then the next one is community ceremonies is the third. And then he says, finally,
Okay,
the
so
community can, this is the key, this is the key here. It's
all right, go
crazy.
ahead.
And he says that ritual confessions and all this, no, and this is a model. He said this is the model for the witch hunting process. But then the hypothesis he derives is very unique. He says, the greater the inclusion of corporate interests at the expense of constituent interests in the structure for making collective decisions is the X1 axis, the X1. The greater the overall rate of witch hunting, Y1. Then, the greater the inclusion of corporate interests at the expense of constituent interests in the structure for making collective decisions, X1, the greater the dispersion of witch hunting, Y2.
Yeah. Okay.
And
So
and then the conclusion I don't even need to read, but we see it happening. So it's not a clean and unclean thing. What we were actually seeing happening was it wasn't that I was dirty or not. In fact, people knew I wasn't. They knew I was not dirty.
you're deviant. That's enough.
That's it. And that's what I
Okay.
mean
So
by the definition of
okay,
essential versus inessential.
this brings us to something that you've been writing about quite a bit and talking about quite a bit, and it's this idea of Soc-realism, SOC realism. I think it's a
Yes.
portmanteau kind of word, like socialist realism. I'm not sure exactly where it comes
It's
from, but
known
you
as
can tell me.
both. I mean, but it's also much older than that. But it was the term was coined primarily in under Stalin with the 1934 Writers' Conference. But it's a much older concept. But
Okay,
it was
so
coined then.
how, how is this? So first, explain the concept and how it's connected in your thinking to what has happened through mechanisms of social control of all of us during the COVID era.
Sure. So there's a few ways that Soc-realism is defined, but if you're going to study the art specifically, like if you look at, say, the art under Stalin, right? Like this book here, they define it as Soc-realist simply because at that time, when if you were not in keeping with Soc-realism and you were labeled a formalist, formalism was deviant. Therefore, you could be purged, killed, you name it, by not following a certain set of rules, including that they were redefining. So the vanguard of the proletariat understood that, or the people who saw themselves as that. That we're talking about the members of the committee who would speak at the plenums.
So
They
okay.
knew.
So just so like what I mean. So there's a leadership, a group that's leading the movement, leading the structure of society forward, like the set of heroes that you look toward.
Well, there's more a committee that's like the international. I'll think of it almost like the original OG, WEF. I mean, this
Yeah.
is
No,
nothing new, right?
but that's a
Right,
political structure. The Soc-realism is not. It's not
right.
strictly a political
Well,
structure.
this is the thing. To these people, everything is political. So there is no distinction. First of all, second of all, what they
But
created was,
it's not formally political the way the Central Committee of the
yes, it is.
Communist Party is.
100% is. At
Interesting.
100%
Okay.
is. So it's not just an aesthetic. So that's a mistake. People think it's just an aesthetic. It's a philosophy, and it's actually the cornerstone of communism, but particularly in the Stalin era. Like, why did Solzhenitsyn need to be purged, or why did other artists, or why was Meyerhold, who was a communist but was saying by hunting formalism you're destroying art? Why did he have to be removed? Why are without so good thing we're not getting killed nowadays, but in essence, the act of killing is a bit inconvenient. If you have a mission in front of you, you could just remove somebody and
You
not have
just
to
need to
kill them.
label somebody fringe now, right? That's enough. You don't need to send them to the gulag.
Well, or weird is the newest one, right? I mean, there's
Yeah.
all these, whatever it is, but the structure of this, and this is what's a key to understanding it, is that the aesthetic is just an expression of the philosophy. So unlike most art movements, which really, there's this misnomer that people think that modern art was, concocted by the CIA, but one of the ways you can say and know something is not. For example, I would assume in medicine you can determine whether something is a foreign body or a naturally occurring body in the body is that you observe how it emerged, right? Whether it was placed there or left there, or did it emerge simply, or did you not notice it before and now you see it, right? It's something that, through technology or through just another act of observation, you can see. Understanding art movements functions essentially the same way. So what is so postmodern art was defined as after modernism, or once modernism, like post totalitarian, postmodern, like as modernism unfolds, art occurred along with the natural sort of evolution of technology, of how mediums were, what was available, where were audiences placed. Much like surgical tools, it naturally shows the progress of medicine, right? You can see a link there, right? Postmodern art, its qualities, for example, the main things that make it postmodern art are that it's self-referential, it's populist, the fourth wall drops, and it allows for the largest amount of masses to be able to share it and experience it with one another, not just as a private audience member. Now, if I say this and I say to you, well, obviously Shakespeare had postmodern elements. Of course it did. So it's not that suddenly a new art emerges that has never been seen before. It's that a lens that looks at, it's like you're not suddenly creating a new human form. A lens that looks at the human body has changed to see something that's true. That's what art movements do. So Soc-realism, however, was not an organic way of creating art at all. So it was concocted as the way to express the philosophy of the of the ideology that is, as I call it, liberation theology. If you look at it like a religion, which is really what it is, you'll see that they need to tell the story they want to tell in a particular way. And that's writers and artists knew how to do that. And this is a very
So
foreign.
what is the story they're telling? So what
Sure.
is the story?
So first of all, I have to say, what are the parts of this story? So
And actually,
unlike,
now is a good time to bring in the dancing nurses.
yes, I'm going to
Now
be
is a
doing
good
that
time to bring
for
the
you.
dancing
Yes, I
nurses,
can do
right?
that for you
So
right now. So in every story, we've got certain elements, right? You've got, you have the writer of the story, right? Then you've got the characters in the story, and then you've got the reader of the story or the viewer of the story, and then you've got whatever the moral goal of the story is, right? And or the telling of the story. So Soc-realism can appear. So we're just going to look at, whether it's a painting or it's a dance or everything has a story it's telling, right? Even I've heard, people when they talk about it, like what story is being told here? Like what are we seeing unfolding here whatever it is happening. The the story of Soc-realism, which is a philosophy, it's more accurate to call it a philosophy, it has the same structure often as any Western. You've got your hero and you've got your villains and you've got a quest of some kind. There's people, there's, appears to be focused on the masses, right? But the key differences here are how the hero is defined, first of all, and also how the author of the story is defined. So Gorky, who was one of the main Soviet writers involved in creating this, and it became the art under Stalin, but also under Mao, I'll add. Mao adopted this very much as well. I mean, fully, in fact, took off with it even further. But under Stalin, it was that Gorky said that the hero in Soc-realism is toil, with a capital T. And the toiler is unthinkable outside the collective. So, for example, at the time, you could say, and I'll use an example from then, and there's more parts to it, but just so you can see the difference. So you could say, okay, well, back then in 1956, when there was an uprising in Hungary, and that you could say that the morality of the Hungarian who stood in front of a tank and said, no, or the mother who actually stood in front of a tank after her kid had been rolled over with a tank, the morality would be quite clear. If the morality in Soc-realism came from anything from within or from any form of either the Ten Commandments or any amalgamated wisdom or lineage or found human experience from thousands and thousands of years. That's not where it comes from in Soc-realism. Soc-realism is entirely based on a morality that comes from outside of you, but even worse, it doesn't come from any individual. It comes from essentially a system. And that system is made up of, oops, sorry, I just lost my earbud here. Can you still hear me? Sorry about that. I don't
yeah,
even
I
know
can
where it
hear you
went.
just fine.
So that system is made up of a few parts, which is, and I'll use this text right now so I don't misscribe. So until about after 89, when the KGB files were released, so the philosophy has a structure, right? And it's not, the morality doesn't come from, for example, it would, if we're going to use an analogy of, what is considered moral in medicine, it doesn't come from either the evolution naturally through social, realism, which is very different. The implication that this happens as a society unfolds socially and socializing, it couldn't be further from the truth. It's it would be, for example, the discovery of using ether or anesthetic, an anesthesia, right? Which at first, when it was found, was considered to be, at best, maybe an indulgence, and if worse, bad for healing, right? At one point, that was the theory. Well, the morality of that would not be based on whether or not it's good for healing or bad for healing or harming the patient or not at all. It comes from something else, which is what is the most chilling about it. So he says, this is a text that really functions as like an unfolding of an art history book, but it talks about Soc-realism as the theory. Now understand that under communism, theory with a capital T doesn't have the exact same definition as theory does in any other lingo, because we're dealing with it would be like saying that communion means the same thing in Christianity as it does in everyday language. It doesn't mean the same thing. So he says that, where did it come from, first of all? So that Soc-realism did not emerge fully armed like some Minerva. Its theory was elaborated progressively throughout the 1930s. In this and subsequent decades, the theory was subject to constant emendation and reinterpretation by the party and by artists. Thus, socialist realist art was never a static phenomenon. It reflected the development of Soviet society and party policy. The pronouncement of the party elite were beacons to artists. At the 1934 Writers' Conference, Andrei Zadanov spoke on the party's behalf. Some of the content of his speech was incorporated by the conference, sometimes verbatim, into the Constitution of the Union of Writers, and has remained current to this day. Following Zadanov, the Writers' Constitution states that socialist realism demands from the artist a true and historically concrete depiction of reality in its revolutionary development, combined with the task of educating. And so the true and accurate, so this is where it gets, it says here,
Okay, so
true,
Wanda, before you go on, I want to bring this back to the dancing nurses. So
I'm
what you
getting,
have
yeah,
here, the analogy then is
yeah,
the public health authorities have declared a pandemic.
right.
The politicians have signed on. The party is fully in favor of this idea that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and it requires of you certain behaviors. It
Well,
requires of
it's
you
even
certain
worse
ways of
than that.
thinking.
It's even worse than that, really. So imagine like you've got a parasite that takes over somebody, and they suddenly start doing things that are counter to their own survival, right? Why does that happen? So in the art form itself, like what it's an expression of, is something that is a philosophy. So it says that, to talk about the theory, like that was how it emerged. It was basing itself on something that was a fabricated. It's like basing a theory in medicine on a fabricated set of
Okay, so
statistics.
here's the story. Here's the
Right.
theory that comes
So the
in the
theory
pandemic.
is right. He says that it is that a precedent for social. So the program says that he's right. Gorky stated that a lot to say about socialist realism. He stated that the hero of socialist realism would be toil, and that the toiler would be unthinkable outside the collective. Individualism he called bankrupt, decrepit, and mercilessly zoological. Like Zadanov, he required artists to look at the present day from the point of view of an assured, glorious future, from the height of the great goals of the future. Most famously asserted that the artist should be both midwife and gravedigger, that he should bury everything harmful to people, harmful even when they like it. In other words, the artist was called upon not only to create a new art, but to exterminate the pernicious elements in the old. Above all, the party aestheticians turned to Lenin's published thoughts and writings, and there they found the perfect embryo of the new art of the Stalin era. The qualities Lenin desired in art, its nardanost, or orientation toward the people, its ideanost, or ideological content, its klassavost, or class content, were isolated as the essential characteristics of socialist realism. But the most important of all was the quality of parteniost, party consciousness, which Lenin had called for. Parteniost was strongly implied in the 34 Writers' Conference definition quoted earlier, in educating the workers in the spirit of
Okay, so Juana,
communism.
we really should get to
This is this last part. It's
the
hard.
dancing
It's
nurses.
tricky, but trust me. The last part is that when you said earlier that the health department, that the party, that this, it was all Partenost is the thing. This
Yeah.
is a concept that doesn't.
Right.
So
So what is it that's being conveyed by the dance? So just so listeners
sure.
could, I'm sure have heard, remember this, but like early in the pandemic and certainly throughout 2020, you'd see pictures of hospitals, of videos coming out of hospitals. Hospitals
All
were
doing a line dance, right?
yeah, they're the center of like the purpose of our policy is to protect hospital systems from being overwhelmed. You have doctors and nurses as essentially the heroes of the pandemic. They
Yes,
are going out and taking
toiling.
risks
They are
that
toiling,
normally that you wouldn't expect people to take. Everyone should be staying home and staying safe. Instead, they're going out and
and
caring
it's
for the people
toil.
that have
It's
gotten sick.
worker, right? So again, if you think about it, the hero is toil. The toiler is unthinkable outside the collective. So what was fascinating about the dancing nurses thing as it unfolded were the differences you would see in different kinds of countries, for example. Now, I recognized it because my mother grew up under the Soviets. So whether it was this idea of, comrades, be spontaneous, this false spontaneity that would come out of what were they called? There was a child movement, I can't remember it right now, the Young Pioneers, that my mother was not allowed to be part of, but all art that was coming out of Romania and all of that was all very much controlled to focus in one direction. You had to follow it. There's a creepiness that happens in false spontaneity or inauthenticity. That was the first thing I spotted, but I was trying to figure out where it began. So the first moments you started seeing this whole, line dancing phenomenon is actually, it's become such a part of it's part of the culture under the Soviets. I would see it when I was there when Eastern Europe was under the Soviets, but now that it's been freed of that, the arts started to bubble out again. But if you look at what goes on in China, for example, and these strange line dances in schools and these strange ways of everything in synchronicity and everything is choreographed, it's rooted in a dance form that was created by Mao's wife, who she was a dancer. And she created a new form of ballet, and it became the only form of dance that was permitted there. And because of my training in I don't come from the lineage that I come from in training is not a lineage based on psychological, figuring out, like, if your mom and if your character loses their mom in this story, you have to act as if you've lost your mom in the story. Like, you have to imagine something or do sense memory or go back, and it's not that way at all. It's a lineage that says it would be found in the body. So emotion and how to, it's much more, it's closer to techniques of clowning and closer to older forms of even dance that comes out of places from India, Asia, you name it. It's called biomechanics. It comes in the body. So when you're watching these things unfold and you've got that training, you can see even the movements. There was a repetition that I kept seeing over and over again. I said, what am I noticing here? What am I seeing? And I was flashing back, so that if you watch the Red Detachment, which was one of the first ballets created by Mao's wife, in that ballet, the idea of that the hero is someone who, even if they're standing out separately from the collective, they end up being somebody that moves the entire collective and then joins it. That there's no individuality at all. The individual is irrelevant in this dance drama, completely irrelevant.
The striking thing was that this was happening country after country after country.
Yes.
You see these videos of the dancing nurses and doctors sometimes, and with strikingly identical kinds of
Right.
rhythm and beat, and it was there was no real identity. They were just, all they were people who were. We were supposed to look at them as heroes, right? Here they are.
Well, there was moments that you could see something real kind of coming out of it a little bit. Like, what's the difference between that and, say, a flash mob? There's a difference, a major difference. You can see the orchestration forced, but also this idea, it wasn't just you were essential or you were dirty. It wasn't that. It was that if you want to have joy, you must comply. If you want to dance, so remember, you couldn't be with people. You were seeing people who could be together. Don't you want to join them in order to get where they are? And we'd never seen anything like this in our history. Like being in New York, where suddenly it was a small price to pay for the simple freedom to be with other people. That was what was being depicted there. And I felt it. I remember often there would be moments where I almost succumbed because I was so deeply lonely. And that's what it is. And Eugene Ionescu, the absurdist playwright, who created the play Rhinoceros, amongst others. He was a Romanian-born, French-trained artist during this period of time, along with Václav Havel and many other dissenters, Dali, etc. He said the following. He said, the supreme trick of mass insanity is that it persuades you that the only abnormal person is the one who refuses to join in the madness of others, the one who tries vainly to resist. We will never understand totalitarianism if we do not understand that people rarely have the strength to be uncommon. And what I think we were watching there, even if the audience was us, the target really, I think, was more than anything the medical community. And I've never said this publicly. I say this because there is something profoundly similar in how a work of live theater or a work of live performance is created, and a lot of the collaboration that has to take place, I would assume, even though I've never, my mom did go to medical school, and you can see it. It's not just trust, but you're not cooperating because not everybody knows the mission you're going on. Your collaboration is that each person's best skills comes forward in order to accomplish a shared goal that is an ideal, which is related to life and healing and hopefully, better outcomes for both the patient, but everybody, right? That's just sort of the understanding. So something greater than just the surgeon or just the one doctor or just the one nurse. It's a really important thing. And the way that system is in place is a very admirable thing. And what I was watching was an utter destruction of it. So the beginning of this phenomenon that came out of China, and in that thread, I show this, is that I show first that I explain, I said, there's something recognizable about it. And I go backwards and show my training about Meyerhold to explain that there's something in just movement that can tell a story. Much like, if you as a doctor walk into a room, you see something about a patient and you just know, you're it's like blink. There's something, I see something. I don't know what I saw, but I see something that tells me that might be the problem. It's not an allergy. Maybe it's something to do with this organ. You just, an instinct. You saw maybe a twitch. You saw a move, something like that, right? Well, the idea in biomechanics is similar. So if I watch, when I watched The Joker, and I can't explain to you why, in the middle after he was doing this dance moment in front of a mirror in that lighting, I turned to my friend and I said, I know the entire plot. Do me a favor, I'm going to stop. I want to see if I'm right. Will you watch it? And then I'll tell me, I knew that he was going to kill his mother. I knew he was going to I knew all of it. Just from that one dance. There's a way body language communicates. It's our oldest form of communication, much older than typing, speaking, like peer review, like anything with writing. It's very young by comparison. And you could even see this back in the days of AIDS. You could see, I think that's part of what made 18B people know that they weren't going to get it this way, by the way. I see a link between the two, very much so. And when you watch this unnatural and form of art that was only created by brutal censorship, brutal fear, killing, you name it. I mean, people don't know how bad these purges were. And also, of course, a form of scientism and Lysenkoism incorporated too into it. And Mao was a poet. That's the reality. These people were artists. I'm sorry to say. You have to stop separating the two because they're dark arts is in medicine or in theater. Peter Brook called it a deadly theater. That's what he called this. Literally deadly, that it kills people. And so the moment that you can watch in China, there was this very odd, I don't even know how I discovered this, but I was trying to find the line, like where did it begin and what was the first in the West, but where did it begin? You see this nurse saying a series of instructions, it seems to children, of what a movement means. So you have oxing, like an ox with a plow, and then you've got, yawning kitten, and you've got all these different things that are in keeping with the fable of Soc-realism, or that everything is about its revolutionary movement and assured glorious future, that's their collaborative world they're functioning in. And so I'm looking at this thing and I keep seeing, for example, yawning kitten repeated, that dance move repeated over and over. But unique in China was that, and this was so chilling, is that in China, you would see patients doing this with it was nurses, but these weren't even nurses. They were just, a patient is unable to protect themselves, unable to be able to take care of themselves. They have to be isolated into this makeshift hospital, which was for all to see. And you had what was appearing to be this generous, brave person that was there making sure they could move and dance. Are you kidding me? If you can move like that, you have no business being held captive in a makeshift factory turned, hospital. These people were too sick. And so the next thing I saw was that next place was Iran, was the next place where they started coming out of. And in Iran was the first moment you would see the doctors with no patients anywhere. Because I believe that in the West, we would not be, I don't even think that those who were starting to mull this over and creating the phenomenon and the challenges, and that's what they were, even before the Jerusalem song. And they were saying to these hospitals, I'm certain that part of the structure they said was no patients. Just show the workers. Whether there were patients there or not became sort of this debate, like, oh, look, they're not really busy, but it's a distraction. Because what was really being said was none of that data matters. It doesn't matter if there's patients here or not.
I mean,
It doesn't matter.
you're also conveying that by these heroic figures doing what they're doing, the patients are gone because they don't need to be there. They've been healed by these people.
That's right, because it's a story. And again, Soc-realism tells a truthful depiction of reality in its revolutionary movement, meaning even if its revolutionary movement hampers in some way, like they're saying now in the WHO, they're talking about how, peace has been their failure to create peace. They don't mean peace the way we interpret peace. They don't mean like COVID zero did not mean. We have to really. This is it's a different language. So that's why at a certain point during the whole fiasco, I kept saying, because I was kind of like a lone artist voice amongst a lot of doctors, and I know this is tricky to say, and I felt a little ashamed. I was like, the data doesn't matter. It's not about the data. There's no amount of data you could ever show that will ever make it something where they will ever say they were wrong, because they will always say they were right, because it was truthful in the depiction of a revolutionary movement, meaning it's not moral. There's no morality so in stating, for example, that doctors were claiming that people would, it was the last words on their lips, there's, I wish I got the vaccine. I mean, I'd seen people dying of AIDS. I know that that's utter bullshit. It does not happen that way. But it didn't matter. The story was all that mattered. And that to call that person ghoulish was actually to insult the positive hero of Soc-realism, which can have no flaws or no faults, because all their mission is the revolutionary movement, because liberation theology says anything is just a utility for that. It's a tool. Like every doctor, tool. That's it. Every patient that dies, if they die with on their lips, I wish I had complied with the promise of their revolution, then their death was meaningful. That's what it is. It's horrible. It's chilling.
Okay, so let's we're coming up on an hour, and I want to respect your time. So I want to close with advice from you about how somebody who's not as deeply steeped in the history of this doesn't have the kind of eye you have for these kinds of I mean, I don't know, let's call it what it is, like a propaganda essentially of sorts.
Worse than that. It's much worse than propaganda.
I mean, the point is, it's trying to overpower me, even outside of my rational faculties, to join in with a movement, with a sort of like way of being that's alien to me, right? So how do I, as somebody who doesn't have that training, how do the listeners who don't have that training, what can we do to to see it? I mean, seeing it, of course, helps understand
And then what do you do about it once you see it?
Yeah, what do you do? Like, how does
Right.
one go about what are practical tips from?
So I think that's a great question, and that's a question that this is why I really hope that people who are in medicine and doctors out there and nurses who live in such a pragmatic world, and because I agree 100%, it's not enough to point out the dark abyss. If you just stare into the abyss with no hope, like what you were describing happening with those patients who were dying of AIDS, right? If you were just looking at that, I mean, that's similar to why my mom quit medicine. She quit med school because she couldn't handle having a patient die, even just passing a kidney stone, just the pain. She just, if it just seems that that's all there is, that's just not, who wants to do that? It's not why people go into, anything. Well, some do, but there's 2 points to this. One, I think, is that there's an art is everywhere. Art is in everything we do. There's this separation of art and science, and art from STEM, and this idea of literalism from figuratism. It is not reality. First of all, it's a false reality that I think is a very mechanized reality that really, really serves more than anyone bureaucrats, but even darker than that. But it doesn't serve what's true. First of all, so one of the phenomena of the dancing nurses, and one thing I'm so grateful that, I mean, I didn't intend to write that thread and have people respond as they did. I just had to get it out. And to this day, people keep thanking me. Now, what are they thanking me for? Because it explained something that, I have a bad feeling about that. Oh, okay, that's what it is. It's similar to any story that's told by a mother to a child, or, I would hope in medical schools when you hear stories about how intuition or instincts also plays a part in diagnosis, or anything.
I mean, I got to say, in my personal case, reading your thread about the dancing nurses, it actually it made me look at the whole videos in a completely different way. I mean, they lost their power over me. I mean, at the same time, I mean,
That's it.
I do
Exactly.
actually. I mean, it's not that I thought. I mean, of course, it is the case that there were doctors and nurses that did sacrifice for. I mean, it was an act of bravery because they thought they were going to
Certainly.
die going and taking care of patients. So
And
you can honor
certainly.
that while at the same time being, quite skeptical about these videos that are essentially trying to manipulate me.
So it wasn't just manipulating you in many cases. So I've heard people say that all of the nurses who were dancing were just ipso facto bad, or
Yeah.
now recreating again a new deviance, by the way. For one thing, we could see that all the nurses, a lot of them got fired for not complying later on after they saw reality. So the manipulation was also on these people. So the manipulation itself is so awful. So that way of tapping into that natural empathy, you would hope, I mean, and not stupid empathy, but real empathy of what doctors and your colleagues, and this happened in the RCU, that all of your colleagues who well-intentioned maybe, to suddenly see that they're actually a victim of this same philosophy. Václav Havel explained this brilliantly. He said that the mistake that people make in these situations, and I call it totalitarian creep, he called it a post-totalitarian system. I say it's totalitarian because we can even have this conversation, but we can see it creeping in and happening, is that it creates this illusion that you have an enemy that's like cabal that you're fighting. It's like there's some group of people who are just, doing this thing, but it actually isn't that. What pulling the veil back behind Soc-realism, I think, shows people is that there's something else that's operating in a way, and I am not a doctor, but my immediate instinct is to say it's almost like the way that people can't recognize that sometimes a virus could actually be good, like a phage for treating a bacteria infection, right? But the spongiform, like this, it's an unknown thing. It almost feels like an automaton. It's like something else that happens. In metaphor, it could be like the nothing from Neverending Story, right? I mean, trying to understand how it operates. That automaton is what is sort of by performing these political rituals and making these declarations of deviance, and then by repeating these imageries which toy with your human instincts and natural human self, including the spirit of party, which is within every human being, and then using that to dehumanize, not just me being dehumanized as a deviant because I couldn't get the vaccine, but then dehumanizing anybody who didn't catch it on right away in some purity test. I mean, it keeps going like that. And the thing that happens is that when you start to recognize it, you can predict, I think, that it's going to happen and what to do preemptively. So, for example, in a recent moment, we see now what's amusing to me about this, because it relates right back to COVID again, because the WHO is so involved in this. We see a self-declared Maoist who has the WHO. Well, I'm going to mispronounce his name because I never say it out loud because it's like invoking Beetlejuice or something. What's his name? How do you say it?
Tedros, you mean?
Yes.
The head
So
of
Tedros, but remember, he himself isn't all that powerful because his role. If he breaks from his ideology, the system that he serves will expel him. Like there's nothing he can do within the system itself. Much like doctors, I'm sure, felt within the system they were dealing with when this overtook everything. The system itself exists, and everything that occurs is only to assure that the system itself survives. That's it. It's like this, almost like a Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or Battlestar. It's like it's like AI, the actual threat, but it's not. It's created by something beyond
so,
us, and
so the seeing of this allows a opening of a space where then I can start to think outside of the
that's exactly
system.
right. So it opens a door to a hidden sphere, is what Vaslav calls it. So this hidden sphere is the only place in which anything can actually happen that will create a break in the totalitarian lie. That's when Live Not by Lies talks about this, Vaslav talks about this. So, for example, what is it that you or Solzhenitsyn actually did that was so bad that you had to be blacklisted? I mean, you were not a threat to Fauci. You were not a threat to the WHO. What was it that you did that was so dangerous that you had to be censored or blocked or, blacklisted or have your reputation annihilated? Like Solzhenitsyn, you just told the truth. So truth in this world of Soc-realist illusion has a power that is much greater than when it's not draped across. And it's not factual, it's truth. There's a difference, major difference. And so right now we're watching as a Soc-realist spectacle is taking place in Paris, right? And everybody is looking at this and they're having all these arguments about all this stuff. They're claiming that that the hero is toil, the toiler, the Christians are being toiled, the Christian people are now being under attack. So it's doing the same thing it did. It's manufacturing deviants, right? Through a corporate structure. But meanwhile, you see Tedros, no one noticed that he handed the torch in the last leg. And that if you look at what he's been saying, the WHO, with its affiliation with the UN, I mean, it started, I think, in maybe 19, I want to say before 2020, actually, so it was 2017, I think, is what it was, declared that their mission now is transformation. What the heck does that mean? And WHO's mission of transformation, health for all, whatever the heck that means. But then you notice at the simultaneous time as they're doing all of this stuff, there's artwork that's being created it's simultaneous with it that was entirely based on what they were calling learning about ministry, like a 3-day study about ministry, about how to deal with religious story. Which, if you imagine from a hospital, I'm sure their lectures were how do you deal with certain, patients that have a certain religion? What do you do with this? It seems to have that same motive, but really it's not. They were basically coming down and trying to say, how do we tell a Soc-realist narrative in order to get the result they want, which was the same result, and even if it's an ideal. The one thing that is the most important, I think, to understand about this stuff is Abram Tertz, who was an anonymous Russian writer, who you can find this piece online if you look for Dissent magazine, because it was smuggled out of Russia after Stalin died, brought to Paris, and then brought to the United States, and he was brought up under this system only, much like med students are only brought up under the system now, right? This is what the world he came up in. And yet he's recognizing how this system is destroying the writer, the love he has for culture, for the art of writing, much like many doctors are worried with the art of medicine, because there's an art to these things. And he says the following. He says, it doesn't matter whether what Soc-realist true believers or practitioners, whether forced or just by habit, whether what they're doing is right or wrong. What matters only is that they're consistent. That's it. And they will keep doing it over and over. So,
and our job as dissidents is to break that consistency, to have a
right.
space to think, say what's true as best we can.
Well, I think that it's even more, as people in the, whether any artist in any field, I think, whether you're in the medical field or you're in, there's an art, Maimonides laid it out pretty well, right? That you were looking at, Vladimir Zelenko, how his dissidence was so powerful, right? Once you reveal the story being told. So I think of the artist Charlie Bell, who was a surgeon, and most people may not even realize. I mean, every single doctor knows Charlie Bell. They just may not know they know Charlie Bell, and he was a painter. And what he did simply was, instead of using the structure of painting, cadavers, his watercolors included the patient, the emotions that were coming out, or in the arm. And I'm struck that most people don't recognize that the reason he did that, the usefulness of this, wasn't simply because he's trying to depict the story of somebody whose arm is cut off as heroic or bold. No, he's saying this patient, this is their expression while this is happening. And from his work, and he couldn't get into he couldn't get into art school, but he could get into med school. That's how training in medicine and training in the arts once was. They were both revered. They were both
Yeah.
very difficult. Like, they were not easy things. And he completely changed how we look at the nervous system. Prior to Bell, everyone thought it was different. And that's
Now
where we
he's
get the
very
term
famous
Bell's
for
palsy.
Bell's palsy, right? Yeah. Okay, Juana, we're going to have you on because there's so many later at some point because there's so much more we could discuss. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. And I hope I didn't offend by anything of trying
No,
to say that I know
you
anything
were
about
great,
your
Juana.
field. I don't. But I'll say this much is that,
there's no offense taken. But how can folks follow you? Like they can follow you on Twitter and
yes, they can
on
follow
Substack.
me. Right. And I also have a YouTube channel, and it's funny. I've been working on this stuff now for years. It just kind of fell into it. I'm not, if there's, they can follow, they can contact me, on Twitter easily, or X. My DMs always are open. My name being Ooana, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm the only
OOANA.
one. OOANA, pronounced Ooana. And you can also find me, through you, and also through YouTube, and through Substack. It's wana.substack.com, and my focus there is on Soc-realism and how it's a war on memory, essentially, is what it is.
Well, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. I hope that I shed some light on some of these things.
Thank you so much.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many: inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.